that this action was not taken a decade ago. Thank you.
Sir Edward Leigh.
I congratulate my right honourable friend on what is an excellent report. And I have to say, I tried to read, it's a very long report, and it's very comprehensive. Now, net zero, of course, is all very well and good, but we need, and of course we need to make effective use of our natural resources. Everybody agrees with that. And cutting out waste from our society, using what we've got better, has always been a sound conservative principle, so none of us can disagree with it. But we need to approach these issues holistically and avoid making huge errors that will set us back in other regards, just to chase the goal of net zero. And let me give one example. Since the second invasion of Ukraine last year, we've realised how tenuous our food security is. The world food supply is incredibly delicate. It makes no sense whatsoever to take good land out of agricultural use to build huge solar farms. Now, I know quite a lot about this because in my constituency of Gainsborough, we have applications to build solar farms on 10,000 acres of good agricultural land. Each of these bits of panels will be 4.7 metres high. If you take 10,000 acres out of good agricultural use, those are acres that could feed 2 cities the size of Hull every year. Vast resources, financial compensation are going to very few people. For instance, if you own 1,000 acres, you could get £2 million a year. Tenant farmers, unlike landlords, are being put out of business. Now, this is a serious issue, and I hope that when people chase goals like net zero, they try and think creatively. For instance, the report quite rightly says, I think on page 9, and I've read it, we must do much more to put solar panels on the rooftops of schools, factories, logistics and distribution centres. We have millions of acres of flat roof warehouses where solar panels can go. But cutting the land, the amount of land that feeds our families and our communities, is, in my view, nonsensical. By all means, have as many solar panels as you like and have it within scale, but we've got applications in this one district that I represent of West Lindsey, greater than the whole of the East Midlands put together. And whatever anybody says, ultimately the consumer is not going to benefit from this, from lower prices. The rewards will go into very few pockets indeed. Now, the excellent report refers, and I like this phrase, and I quote, to a clean and endless supply of wind blowing across the North Sea. In Lincolnshire, you know, I can go up behind my house, I can stand on the top of the walls, and I can see in the distance huge arrays of wind farms in the North Sea. They get built with virtually no objections. We are becoming, and we are perhaps now, world leaders. But when it comes to onshore windmills, I do assure the Honourable Lady for Brentford and Isleworth, I understand what she's saying, but we've had applications in my constituency. These things are taller than Lincoln Cathedral, which for 400 years was the tallest building in the world. None of these huge windmills are going to be built in Brentford and Isleworth, I'm afraid. And if they were, there would just be such fantastic opposition that it would never happen. They're all going to be built in rural constituencies. Well, I've mentioned the Honourable Lady, so the least I can do is give way to her.
There are actually at least 2 windmills in Brentford and Isleworth, one on top of Ormston Wire in Isleworth, and the other, which many, many people see as they drive in or out of London on the elevated section of the M4, of course, the large one on Sky at Sky TV Studios.
Well, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I don't think there's much enthusiasm for building windmills as tall as the Lincoln Cathedral in urban areas. So, I mean, we can say that in theory we're in favour of onshore windmills, but I do assure that every time they are proposed, there is a gruelling process lasting many years of public inquiries, fierce opposition. How much better to concentrate our resources offshore? And as I say, we are world leaders in offshore, and there's never any objection. Now, the report also refers to achieving net zero through better public transport. Now, the report talks about getting more people into sustainable public transport instead of individual car journeys, something that I use, and I when I'm down in London, I hate to use a car. I'd much rather use the tube, the bus, or even the Boris bike. But let me just talk about rural areas such as Lincolnshire. We've been calling for better rural transport links, public transport links in rural areas for decades. Very little has been done. Indeed, they've got worse and worse. Too often we've fallen victim to service cuts when the budgets coming from central government have been reduced. If services for people who live in less built-up areas are only 2 hourly, or even once a day, or indeed in my village where I live, not at all, I'm afraid you are reliant on a car, not just to socialise, but for actual essential activities such as working or shopping. So if the government is serious about net zero in public transport, it has to radically upgrade our rural transport links, including the frequency of service. But this is never going to happen because it's so fantastically expensive. So I'm afraid that we're going to be reliant on cars for decades, or perhaps forever, in rural areas such as Lincolnshire. So by all means, reduce the carbon footprint of buses, put solar panels on them if you want. But a net zero bus that only comes once a day isn't much use to you. It's 2023, but the sale of all conventional cars is going to be banned from 2030 and hybrids by 2035. Lincolnshire is 2,687 square miles, 1,719,600 acres. The government needs to make clear how they are going to roll out charging points across such a vast area. It is simply not going to happen by 2030. I mean, are they in touch with the energy supply companies? Have they been in discussion with rural councils about this transition? This is a very serious issue. I mean, we have to, in rural counties, we simply, I just put this to the Minister, and he represents a Scottish constituency. This is simply not practical, and we need to think very seriously about this. Now, my Right Honourable's excellent report, Friends report, points out the UK's housing stock is much older than most similar nations. More than half of homes in England were built before 1965, and almost 20% before 1919. His report points out this has a huge impact on energy efficiency. We all know, I live in an old house, I know well how difficult it is to heat it. But nearly half of low-income households in England are in homes with an EPC rating of D or lower. They use 27% more gas, 18% more electricity on average than higher-rated homes. These are the least well-off people, yet there's no point us preaching to them about the value of heat pumps, which they can't afford. Lower-income households simply do not have the disposable income to pay for this kind of investment, unless we are prepared to devote massive resources to helping them. We're also paying, of course, the price for decades of failing to invest in clean nuclear energy. In the wake of the OPEC and the oil crisis in the 1970s, France's Gaulist Prime Minister, Pierre Mesmer, realised how vulnerable his country was. He ordered a huge upscaling in French nuclear energy. The result is that France now has a cheaper, cleaner energy supply that is selling the surplus to needy countries like ours. As I said, we need to approach this issue holistically. The UK's contribution to carbon emissions is minuscule on the global scale. I'm not saying that's an argument for doing nothing, but it is a fact. If we achieve net zero, the gain for the planet can be wiped out by a tiny percentage increase in China or India's huge carbon emissions. These are growing, developing economies. Let's be realistic about it. They look at us telling them to cut their emissions and think we are cheating them. Both of them have complex relationships with the West. We are very friendly with India, but we are the former colonial power there. The rise of Hindu nationalism makes that relationship even more complicated and difficult. As for communist China, they view us with disdain. Judging by their actions, they are not wholly convinced by environmentalism. If you view the world from a totally materialist, utilitarian perspective, as the communist government does, why would you be as environmental as we claim to be? You would see all the leading developed and industrialised nations like ourselves, who were totally reckless when we were industrialising, lecturing them. And now that we are on top, We tell developing countries to toe the line and don't do what we did to get to the top. That's their view. They view our preaching as hypocritically on the one hand and patronising on the other. That is the... I'm about to finish, but I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Isn't he making an excellent point? Why we actually should lead by example. We can't tell others what to do unless we show leadership ourselves.
Yeah, of course we should lead by example, and I accept everything that's put in the report. We've got to lead by example, but I hope that my right honourable friend, who's an excellent minister, has written a wonderful report, I hope he accepts that some of the points I've made in terms of being realistic, particularly in terms of rural areas, should be taken into account. And that's the point I wish to emphasise, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it is